Now, there are some moments of mid-century America that really require a good deal more elaboration. And one of the aspects of some of the more dramatic moments of the mid-century period um, are often informed by factors that sometimes don't receive enough attention. Um, One of those categories is that of religion and politics. And I think it's difficult to fully grasp, for example, the McCarthy hearings of the 1950s without taking into account some of the prehistory of that. Now, historians and students of history will be familiar with the earlier Red Scare of the 1920s and the Palmer raids as a kind of precursor to the McCarthy era. And we could talk about whether this is a persistent strain of American history. Um, but a couple of points about the McCarthy hearings that I wanted to underscore. One is, as I said, this aspect of a religious war that informed a lot of the ideology of the time, a lot of the energy behind the Red Scare of the 1950s and the 1920s. So we have to look at this already existing ideological warfare that had been brewing to some extent for centuries, but certainly since the late 19th century. Many of the critics of capitalism, Marx, Bakunin, and many of the other left critics and radicals were radically anti-clerical. And for Marx, as for Bakunin, religion was not just the opiate of the poor. It had their critique had an additional layer of energy behind it precisely because they were Enlightenment figures. Science, in their view, could do no wrong, and what could be more anti-scientific than religion? So a lot of this actually filtered into the dramas that we went through in the 20th century that kind of culminated in the McCarthy hearings. We have to recall a couple of fairly sensationalist events. Most of us are familiar with the doomsday sight of Soviet tanks, Warsaw Pact tanks, rolling into Hungary in 1956. But that was preceded by the imprisonment and the show trial of a very popular and charismatic Catholic prelate, Cardinal Monzenti. And Monzenti was put on trial. Stalin and his minions were famous for show trials, and you do have to watch it with trials, as we saw with Sacco and Vanzetti. They can be a show trial, but they're also going to galvanize world support and world opposition. And in many cases, the regime that undertakes a show trial ends up having itself put on trial by the world community. And certainly that was the case with the show trial of Cardinal Monzenti. Now, that was not lost on the American body politic, which had, as we talked about earlier, deeply philosophical opposition to communism owing to its religious roots. If you think about the early visitors to the United States, to Tocqueville or Max Weber a century later, they were really struck by the power that the role of religion played in American society. So when we think about the rise of anti-communism in the 20th century, we have to see it as part of a larger dynamic that was played out. And this would be revisited, of course, in a lot of the newly emergent nations and their leadership if they espoused communist ideology. So it's not as if American society once a religious leader, that not really into theocracy, but the opposition that the associated with communism, owing to this vehement, almost visceral hatred of the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe and in China, helps to explain the kind of fertile bed that politicians in the mid-century could really draw on. When, for example, during the course of the Korean conflict, flushed from what was actually a brilliant amphibious maneuver by General MacArthur, MacArthur, continued to press his case that the United States needed to prosecute this war into China. It was his religious sensibilities and his sense of where the body politic was when it came to combating communism wasn't really that far off. And he had a lot of supporters in the United States. MacArthur's kind of an interesting figure. He certainly understood the power of religion, both in a military sense and ideologically as a support for one's war efforts. It is alleged in some recent scholarship that he considered, more aggressive proselytizing of Christianity in Japan in the aftermath of the void that was created. So all of this really fell on the American public in the mid-century on a field that had already been sown with a couple of different layers of Manichaeanism. Remember, the heavy emphasis on the literal interpretation of some of the books of the Old New Testament, most especially the book of the Apocalypse, really spoke to the idea of a coming conflict between the forces of evil, the forces of Satan, and the forces of good, the forces of Christ and Christianity. And that became the lens through which much of the ideology of the Cold War played out. I can think of no better example of that than Ronald Reagan's statement that the Soviet Union was, the evil empire, borrowing a page from Star Wars. This, as a footnote to that, of course, famously, the Ayatollah Khomeini had referred to the United States itself, given its history in Iran, as the Great Satan. So I guess we could paraphrase Jean-Paul Sartre and say that any nation is potentially another nation's Satan. Keep in mind this theme, really, of religion and politics and where this strong and virulent anti-communism came from. I remember in the 1970s I was doing research up at Maryknoll, which was one of the leading missionary organizations in China in the early part of the 20th century. And there was a bishop, Bishop Walsh, who was imprisoned by Mao's government and tortured. He had come back to the United States and was up at the headquarters in Maryknoll, and he enjoyed a kind of larger-than-life status. He was considered a saint, by those who believed. It was always this sense that, he fought the communists. He was like a spiritual warrior, and that mindset really did factor into it. So the anti-clericalism, that was, really kind of the legacy of the Enlightenment, and also the theoretical positions of Marx and Marxism really did hopefully inform and a lot of the politics of the mid-century, and I hope adds to your understanding of the period.